Great. Okay. Let me make sure I can advance the slides. Okay. So first, we'd like to start off by expressing our humble gratitude to the past and present residents of Karluk. Karluk is the homeland and traditional territory of the Alutiiq Sugpiaq people who have cared for and stewarded these lands for at least 6,000 years. And the people of Karluk have really been instrumental in the success of this effort, and it really would have been impossible without their guidance and hard work. I'm joined here tonight by Grant Crosby and Dorothy Gray, who is the chair of the board of ROSIA. And you all know Grant. Congratulations, Grant, on your award tonight. And the three of us will be co-presenting this slideshow, but as was mentioned earlier, so many people and organizations have been critical in the success of this effort, including Trish Neal of Preservation Alaska. Also, congratulations on your Lifetime Achievement Award, Trish. Well deserved. Judy Bittner, State Historic Preservation Officer, representatives from the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Sitka and Alaska, several residents, parishioners, and community leaders from Karluk, John Wachtel at NPS, representatives of Koniag, and so many more. And the NPS, myself, and Grant and John Wachtel have been able to provide technical assistance and support on this project through our Heritage Assistance Program, which extends cultural resource conservation efforts to our external partners throughout the country and the world. So if folks are wondering, this is not a National Park Service site, how are we involved? So it's through our Heritage Assistance Program. This truly is a multidisciplinary effort, as was mentioned before, that draws on expertise from community, private, state, and federal and nonprofit partners. So I'm going to hand it over real quick to Dorothy and Grant to talk a little bit about the history and accomplishments of ROSIA. There are just a few slides here, Dorothy and Grant. I'll go ahead and advance the slides when you're ready.
Sure. Dorothy, do you want to start?
Well, I was going to turn it over to you because you were one of the founding members.
So you can see it. Okay, so you can see it, everybody. It's a hot potato. Who's going to start here? ROSIA, not too different or dissimilar from Preservation Alaska, about 20 years younger. And next year, ROSIA, the nonprofit, will turn 20 years old. So it was started in 2002 by then Bishop Nikolai, who had the idea to pull a group of people together and said, what if we start a nonprofit to save all these historic Russian Orthodox churches around the state? And it's a pretty remarkable mission. And if you look at a map like this that illustrates where all of these churches are, it's an incredible portfolio of buildings. And you can see a lot of them have National Register status, which you can see the list down at the bottom. And several of them are the highest honor that we bestow upon historic sites in the United States. They're National Historic Landmarks. And so the nonprofit started in 2002, but it really struggled for many years trying to figure out how it would undertake this huge mission. But one of the first steps it did was established a priority list of 5 churches. And those 5 churches, you might see some photos here in a minute. This is St. Nicholas and Juneau. But the intent was to have some that were very visible. Ones like that were on the road system, for example, like Kenai and St. Nicholas here in Juneau, on the road system, quote, in quotes. So several of those were chosen early in the organization. But it took many years for them to get leverage to really move these forward. Just quickly to look at a couple of these photographs, an interesting story in St. Nicholas. One day a donor, something you never hear on these things, a donor got off the ship and deposited a check for $20,000 and said, here's some money to replace your roof. That was great news. And when the roofer was getting around to replacing the roof on the bell tower, his foot went right through the roof. And the bell tower was immediately lifted off and then set on blocks for almost 7 years before ROSIA was able to get the funding back up to put it on. So that's an example of the work that ROSIA has been doing. Dorothy, jump in at any time.
Well, here is our church in Kenai. And this was a Save America's Treasure grant that we actually started in 2008 when the stock market crashed. And you can see here in this slide all the clapboards were removed on the left. And on the right-hand side, you can see the deterioration of the logs on the right, to the point where you could reach in with your hand and it would just crumble. It would be like sawdust. We were able to beg people for funding, and we were able to restore the foundation, replace all these logs, and thanks to the National Park Service and their expertise, we were able to stabilize the church. On the interior, which you can't see, is a framework of rebar that boxed in the church to keep it. Grant, help me out with the architectural term here.
Yeah, we added some steel inside the wall to support it because it was unsupported, but none of it is visible today.
Right. And then 2 years ago, we embarked upon a huge project here to replace the roof. And here you can see the scaffolding. The roof was taken off and ice and water shield was put onto the roof, and well, was it skip sheathing, I guess, underneath at first, plywood, and then the ice and water shield, and then the new cedar shingles that were eventually painted with linseed oil to protect them.
Dorothy, there's a or sorry to interrupt. There's a request to speak up if you have if you can get closer to your microphone. Sorry.
Okay, let me crank up my volume here. Okay, so you can see here the scaffolding that was erected, and we had craftsmen from a local company in Kenai, Blazy Construction, who took apart all of the domes, and we even found a treasure inside of one of the domes with some historical artifacts from the last time that the church had been worked on. But it was a huge project, and at this point, the roof is, the best part is it not only looks beautiful, but it's waterproof.
I'll just add one thing quickly to that before we go on to the next one, and that is the Holy Assumption, rather. That 2010 Save America's Treasures grant. One of the requirements of that grant was to develop a preservation easement, a conservation easement. And as we heard from Monty earlier, that is how this became one of AHP's, or Preservation Alaska's, conservation easements that they are managing. So it's from that project in 2010. And it's excellent to have another set of eyes inspecting this. And the last thing I'll say before we turn it back over to Sheena is that on that small list that Rosia had were these 5 buildings, and one of which was Karluk, that you're going to hear about now, the Ascension of our Lord Karluk Church. But, and you can advance to the next slide if you want, Sheena, and I'll turn it over to you in just a minute. Sure. One of the founding members, a gentleman named Bill McGrew, was married in this church, and it became a really important component of his mission and others on the board to really save this beautiful church. It's in a remarkable location that you'll see here in a minute if you haven't seen it already. And Bill unfortunately passed away, I think, around 2008. So it's really a pleasure to see this project come to fruition, at least getting it away from the bank and preserving it. So it's been on the list for a long time, but as you'll hear from Sheena, it's very hard to access and there's a lot of logistical challenges. So with that, hopefully that's a good enough summary of Rosia, and turning it over to you, Sheena.
That's great, thank you. And it just makes me think, you know, you're speaking of folks who have been connected to this building in particular, but to the community of Karluk. I think along the way in being involved in this project, I've heard so many names of people that are now outside of Karluk that either have ancestral connections to people who are buried in the cemetery, or their mother was born in Karluk, and where they spent time as a child there. So lots of folks, lots of well-known folks around Alaska have connections to Karluk. So these are just a couple of maps for reference showing the location of Karluk on the west coast of Kodiak Island. You can see my cursor, I assume, and then a relatively recent aerial satellite image of the community, showing the location of the contemporary community where much of the modern village has been relocated, the airstrip and the access road. And then here is the Ascension of Our Lord Chapel here up on this bluff. Some real quick facts about the site. The church building that's there now was built in 1888. It was listed on the National Register in 1980. And the archaeological record indicates that there are more than 6,000 years of occupation activity at Karluk. The site consists of the church building, associated structures, archaeological remains associated with the long occupation of the area, as well as the community cemetery. There are a number of these, but here are a couple historic photos showing the original native village infrastructure at the mouth of the Karluk River, all of which is now gone, and a historic photo of a traditional Alutiiq sod house called a barabara, which is located near the church, but is most likely completely eroded away at this point. If there are remnants left of this feature, they are deeply buried and probably quite deteriorated. Just a few photos from the 1980s. These photos were taken not long after at least one significant storm event that occurred in 1978 at Karluk. And this event is remarkable in that it really marks the beginning of some of the more dramatic environmental changes that have occurred at the site. And it eventually prompted the relocation of the village and also led to the threats, some of the threats that the site faces today. You can see when the church was originally, the church was originally constructed on this kind of gradually sloping hillside. And as we progress here, and those of you who know the site, you will see some very dramatic changes over time. Here are some photos from the 1980s and 1990s showing some of the considerable changes that have occurred at the site around erosion and flooding and storm events. And Dorothy and Grant, feel free to pop in anytime if you have comments about any particular slide.
The only thing I would add, if you back up one slide to the one with the 4 there, is if you notice the large building near the structure there in the upper left, there was a remarkably large cannery operation, many cannery operations on the spit there, because as I'm sure you all are aware, the Karluk River was one of, if not the most prolific salmon river in the world. It was really incredible. The amount of salmon. And so that's really what drove the idea for building the church, because one of the canneries offered to build housing for the local community, but they asked for a church instead. And that's how the story goes, that the church was built in 1888 for that reason. So I wanted to point that out, the canneries that were a part of it in the salmon industry.
In 2007, the Corps of Engineers assessed the bluff erosion occurring at the site and published a short report on the potential continued threats in the area. And in 2015, the threats to the site became even more severe, and the awareness in the historic preservation community and in the community of Karluk really heightened, which prompted a site visit by members of Rosia and a number of others to kind of start formulating a strategy for the potential relocation and restoration of the main building. So here are a couple photos from that site visit. And Grant, maybe you can speak a little bit about some of these preservation activities that have occurred at the site.
Sure.
Since that 2015 site visit.
In 2019, the Park Service, or our office, was given some funding by the DC office to support a project in Alaska. So we were able to contract RIM architects to undertake HABs drawings, Historic American Building Survey drawings. And Bryce Klug was the project manager. I think he's still on the call tonight from RIM Architects. And I think it's safe to say that we weren't entirely sure that we would save this building. We didn't know the next erosion event, when that might come, what other issues we had facing the project. And so one of the things that we thought would be critical to do is to capture it for the Library of Congress. And that Historic American Building Survey, if you're familiar with it, these drawings will end up in the Library of Congress. But it does a couple of other things as well. Because the site is so remote, it's really hard to understand what's there, working with contractors without getting them on site. So now we have incredibly accurate drawings that we can use to do takeoffs and other design efforts. What's interesting about this is on the left, you can see a very colorful image. And Bryce and his team were able to get out on site and in a matter of 4 hours, do a high definition 3D scan of the building. And it was pretty remarkable to be able to charter a plane from Anchorage, have the good weather to go down there, scan it, and then be back in Anchorage in 1 day. From there, Bryce's team was able to prepare these drawings, and that's what you see on the right. So you see that continuation of the south elevation. I'll also point out just the beauty of this building. It is so remarkably well constructed, and the details are terrific. When you have the opportunity to look at some of the close-up details, it really is one of the more beautiful buildings in the state that I've ever had the opportunity to visit. Next slide.
Well, that's saying a lot because Grant, we know you've been to a lot of buildings in Alaska. This is a figure that was originally developed by our colleague Sean Mack at BIA, kind of estimating the bluff erosion over time. And as you can see, the 1981 bluff edge, the 2008, the 2011, about 2015, and an approximation for May of 2020. Here's some photos from the site visit that was conducted. I believe this was from 2020 as well, Grant.
No, this actually is from June 21st, 2021, this summer.
Oh,
and
okay.
The photograph there is Merle Sykes. He's the contractor. You'll see some more activity from here in a minute. His arm is raised. He's indicating where that bluff is. A lot of that grass is overhanging like a cornice, but he is now within 8 feet of that edge. It's pretty crazy. So that's what.
And Grant, can you talk about these two photos as well?
Sure. The interior, one thing, we show a lot of the photos of the outside, but the beautiful interior, and you can see the iconostas, the wall of icons there, and that beautiful dome that you see where it brings in light from the dome that's on the roof of the cupola. Interesting color scheme. We've done a lot of research trying to figure this out, and we have seen the green elsewhere on some Russian Orthodox churches. Another challenge among the many, you'll note the cardboard on the floor. We heard about the Eldred Rock Lighthouse, and we have similar asbestos tiles here. We have another problem, another hazardous material to work through. On the right, we included this photo because in that site visit in 2015, we approached the site and this is what we found. The church bell is holding the door shut with an extension cord. The reason for that is a bear broke in through the door, broke the latch, walked around. The footprints are still visible on the carpet today, and then fortunately walked back out the door instead of jumping through a window. But it's a pretty interesting story for Karluk and very typical, I suppose, of Alaska.
And I'll just note that this is one of the details I think that is so beautiful that I noted being out there.
Yep.
So this is an aerial image from one of the site visits that was conducted in May of 2020. And you can kind of get a sense for the area of the bluff that is closest to that north elevation of the building. But this is an image that was taken from a different angle, but similarly an aerial drone image that was taken from the site in August of 2021 at the start of the relocation effort. And you can see the even more dramatic encroachment of the bluff erosion near that north elevation. So before and after the move, the team was able to have a ground penetrating radar survey completed across much of the site in order to identify possible burial locations and other subsurface features that may be present. We also hoped that the GPR would help us to minimize disturbance to any subsurface objects, be they burials or archaeological features. I can't take too much time to talk about this in depth today, but would be happy to share more about this with anyone who may be interested at another time. But essentially, the results of the GPR survey will continue to aid the community and the project team greatly in determining One, the approximate number, location, orientation, and depth of burials at the site. It'll help us understand which burials are located in areas that are really vulnerable to continued erosion of the bluff edge. And three, it'll help us determine the level of effort that might be needed to relocate any individual burials if desired. So August 2021 is when we embarked on the temporary move of this building to get it away from the bluff. And so these are just a few images of what things looked like when we arrived on site. This is a pano from down below looking up at the church so you can get a sense for the full bluff. It's quite striking. And prepping the site for the move involved placing cribbing beneath the building, jacking it up, and sliding it slowly along gigantic steel beams using rollers. And this is just a little bit of footage of the crew getting their cribbing and their beams in place. We had some sunny days and we had some very rainy, muddy days while we were out there working. Just to give you a little sense for the setting. It's quite remarkable. And I won't have that play all the way through, but this is just a clip showing one of the large beams being placed and how the movers place it. They have their cribbing set, and so they're ready to place this large beam, which is what the roller is placed upon to gently and slowly and carefully pull the building.
And another one of the logistical challenges is all of the equipment and cribbing you're seeing had to be delivered by barge. And that's what contributed to the high cost of the project. There's no real easy way to get the things there.
Well, I might add too that before it hit the barge, it had to be trucked all the way from Wasilla to Homer, put on the ferry, taken to the city of Kodiak, and then put on the barge to Karluk, where it had to await a 9-foot tide to get to land on the beach.
So this is a snippet of the first pull of the building, and we could share a lot of video with those who might be interested. We have lots of time-lapse video that was taken during the effort. I just have a couple of quick snippets today, but please reach out to Rosia if you have a desire to see some more video from the project, because it was well documented. But this was the first pull, and I'll go ahead and let you all see how it feels to watch this building move.
It's also amazing to see that there's these two skid steers that are pulling it. When one thinks of moving a building, you think there'd have to be a lot of really heavy equipment. But as you can see here, it's really pretty simple what they've got rigged up.
So it was a slow and steady effort. These are a couple images that show our first look at the original footprint beneath the building, which is here. I'm kind of on the other side of the building at this point from the video that you just saw. This is the original footprint of the building, and you can see it also here. And some more progress shots that give you a sense for how high the building was elevated in order to get the cribbing and the beams placed and obviously maintaining it level. And just so you know, the building was moved in somewhat of a zigzag pattern. It was pulled a little bit to the south, and then it was moved a little bit to the east, and then moved further south. So there were kind of 3 moves and adjustment of direction.
One of the most remarkable things of this church is the setting that you can see there on the right, looking out over Shelikof Strait it really is spectacular, and I hope you all have a chance to see it someday.
So I was there monitoring the majority of the activity on site, mostly to ensure that there was limited to no disturbance to any archaeological deposits, and most importantly to any burials. And some artifacts of relatively recent origin were observed in disturbed contexts, and I'm going to share some photos of those with you today, but I observed no disturbance of any significant archaeological deposits, intact features, and I did not observe any disturbance to any marked or unmarked grave sites, thank goodness. So this is just a selection of some of the mostly historic materials that were encountered, consisting of a variety of metal artifacts, wooden artifacts, bottles. These dishes here on the lower right were located in the building, and much of this stuff has just been boxed up and placed in the building so that the community can determine how they want to care for the objects. This lower left-hand corner here, it's a rusted out shotgun. Some old bottles. This one still with a lid and liquid inside. Newspaper inside the buildings, a few fragments of ceramics and glass, cork. This is just another snippet of the building being pulled. This is when it was pulled to the east.
Sheena, I would imagine if there was a glass of water at the inside of the church sitting there, it probably did not spill.
Yeah, I think that was the contractor's promise at the beginning, was that they were gonna place a glass of wine inside the building. No, I'm teasing. They didn't really, but we had wondered, you know, how much jostling would occur to the building during the move, and it really was a very delicate, slow, and steady process. And I have to give the movers credit for doing a phenomenal job of keeping it very smooth.
We might mention too at this point that all of the icons and artifacts from the church had been removed and prior to the moving of the building and transported into the village for safekeeping, because even until the last month, we weren't sure that we would have the funding to move the church. And if it was lost, we didn't want to lose all of the artifacts and icons within.
Absolutely. The community did a lot of really hard work to get that done before the move activity. Oops, sorry. Just a couple little video snippets. A couple other progress shots. Here in this photo on the right, you can really get a good sense for the original footprint of the building. This kind of raised, drier area. And this is pretty much where the building ends up. It's about 80 feet inland in a zigzag direction from its original footprint. Here's a better aerial to give you a sense for where it was. This kind of raised rectangular area is the original footprint, and where it ended up. And the movers spent some time working with our working group members who live in Karluk, community members, parishioners, to make sure that before they set it down for its temporary home, that they felt that it was in the right place, that they were comfortable with where it was, and no additional, concerns on the part of the community were still outstanding. So they were able to set it down after those discussions. And these are just a few last shots that were taken actually by a resident of Karluk, Dustin Reft, who has a drone And I just love these photographs. They really show the kind of drama and severity of the situation. In particular, this one on the upper right gives you a sense for, you can really see the original footprint of where the building was, and this kind of sloping nature of where it was precariously perched above that bluff, which is being now undercut quite dramatically. So this image really was really illustrated well for me what we were facing. And I think we can, Dorothy and Grant and I can say, and the other folks that have worked on this project confidently, that if it had not been moved this summer, there's a good chance that even if it hadn't collapsed or fallen off the bluff, that it wouldn't have been a safe enough situation to actually move the building. Here's just a couple before and after shots. And you can see with respect to this shed here, how far it was moved. So I'd love to hear if anybody has any questions. This is just a video that I took that's just kind of like a site overview, and it'll pan around the entire site so you can kind of see when it is beautiful in Karluk. It's pretty remarkable, the weather and the setting. So thank you very much for the time tonight.
Tina or Grant, can one of you say the contractor's name?
Sure. The contractor, well, let me back up and do a pitch here for Trish. Within, I'd say, minutes of learning about this project, Trish had already called 3 moving contractors. And it was very quick that she found these 3. Three went to the site in May of 2020 on a chartered plane, which AHP or Preservation Alaska helped fund to get them there. And then 2 of those contractors, Bryant Construction and John's General Contracting, both out of Wasilla, teamed up to do the project. The 3rd contractor was Green Street Construction, and they're a building mover out of Anchorage. So those were the 3, and 2 chose to team up.
Go ahead.
What's the next phase? You said this is a temporary site. What's the long-term siting plans?
That's a really good question. Dorothy and Sheena, do you want me to take that one on?
Please, yeah.
So we're still trying to determine a location where this can rest for a new permanent home. And so a lot of discussions are happening within the village and other landowners. One of the challenges is that the Diocese of Sitka and Alaska needs to own the land that the church is on. So we've got to figure out how to make that happen. We also want to choose a site that's safely inland from the bluff. So somewhere perhaps closer to the village. And so some ideas are being pitched. In the meantime, we hope to mobilize a project as early as next summer to stabilize the building, which will include putting a new roof on it and fixing the bell towers. You can see in this photo, it's got some issues with those columns, and probably mothball it for a year or 2 until a final location is decided. Once that location has been confirmed, a new foundation will be constructed, the building will be moved and then set on it. And then we'll continue the restoration work because there's a lot more that needs to be done on the inside to make it useful again. So I'd say there's two more phases probably that are coming.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I think there's some people on that aren't really aware of where Karluk is. You can't just drive there from on a road. So Grant or Sheena, you want to explain what it's like to get there?
Yeah.
Sure.
Wait, go ahead, Sheena, you take this one.
Well, you'll have to fill in some holes, but in terms of equipment getting there, as Dorothy had mentioned, the contractors drove from their warehouse location and from Wasilla to Homer. And then my understanding is they loaded up the ferry with all of their equipment and supplies. and took the ferry, which is a 16-hour, I think at least 16-hour ferry journey from Homer to Kodiak City, and then unloaded the ferry, and then there in Kodiak reloaded all of the supplies and the equipment onto a barge, which then traveled from Kodiak to Karluk in order to land. And you can't really see it, but this is right beyond where my cursor is the drop off from the bluff. And the barge landing zone is kind of actually down over here on this side. But they require at least 9-foot tides to land any large barge at the barge landing area in Karluk. So that was a consideration in terms of timing. I don't know, Grant, do you know how, or Dorothy, how long the journey is from Kodiak to Karluk by barge? How many hours? It's on the other side of the island. And so.
Yeah, I think it's a good solid day or just
Yeah.
short of a day. Yeah.
Yeah. So then the rest of us flew in by small aircraft from Anchorage to Kodiak and then Kodiak to Karluk. And so what am I missing? What else? Logistically.
Well, I mentioned, yeah,
Supply.
logistically, you can also charter planes direct from Anchorage and they can land on the airstrip there, which is about an 1.5-hour journey. We've done that about 3 times, but it's extremely costly, anywhere from $4,000 to $8,000 round trip. And as I mentioned, Preservation Alaska contributed to that effort that was critical in May of 2020 to get those contractors on site. And we had to do it. It was right during the pandemic, right during the peak of the pandemic at that time. And we didn't want to have any exposure with the village. So we chartered this plane and they came in and were on the ground for about 4 hours and then left. So ideally, we'd be flying back and forth, contributing to this project in many ways, but it's really logistically challenging. And you can see by the weather here, you've got to have a pretty good dose of patience for variable weather and the opportunity of getting stuck in Kodiak or in Karluk. So
Well, and like many of the projects that were mentioned tonight that have been weathering the pandemic, similarly, the work that was done in Karluk had to take into account the safety considerations and concerns about bringing our goal was not to inadvertently introduce the virus to the community. And so we underwent strict testing protocols and masking and social distancing protocols. And our plans shifted a lot, specifically in response to the pandemic. And unfortunately, it would have been wonderful if more folks could have been out for the move, but we reduced our numbers dramatically, specifically because of the pandemic. So it was an added, in an already very complex effort. It was an added stressor.
Sheeta Monty had a question about the different colors on the GPR map, the red and black. Are you able to distinguish why?
Yeah. There were 2 phases of GPR work that were conducted, Monty. One before the move happened, and then we were able to get the rest of at least the parcel owned by the diocese, much of the rest of that surveyed following the move. So it just represents 2 phases of survey that was conducted by the contractor.
I'll cap up my comments here just by reiterating the fact that this project would not have happened without all of the different groups coming together. It is exactly what you'd expect from a preservation. A ground swelling of preservation is coming to do everything they can to make this happen. And it wouldn't have worked unless we had all these different disciplines and all these different organizations. So it really was a great example of what can be done when people pull together. And it would be great to have this kind of energy on all of the projects that we saw tonight. So hopefully we can all rally around and help those out.
I would also add, no one asked about the cost of the project. And I'll just throw it out there. Does anybody have a wild guess of how much it costs to move the church to this temporary location? I'm looking at the chat line here, see if anybody has some good guesses. No clue. Well, it was almost $500,000, and that's just for the temporary move. We were very, very fortunate to have had a generous donor from a group who supported this idea and is still very interested in helping to move the church to its permanent location. One of the things that Grant alluded to was that we have to keep the church on diocese property. And the other thing we want to do is keep the orientation of the church in the same direction. Historically, the Karluk River has been one of Alaska's most productive salmon streams with 5 different species, and it's been a beacon to fishermen. So we want to move it upriver, if possible, closer to the village, where it will still maintain its same orientation, east-west, and be a beacon to fishermen, but also be closer to the village and within walking distance for the parishioners.